Well, let's get to Anne Hathaway in a minute. I want to talk about Shakespeare and love, and Shakespeare in love. You're very good in that new book. There's a wonderful thing you say in your book about Shakespeare was more interested in providing magnificent myths for the unlettered rather than entertaining the aristocracy. I take the force of that to mean that he wasn't all that interested in impressing the wits and the schoolmen and the university wits and so on. That he actually had a sense of the public, which was quite uncommon, quite new.
I think it's important. I think it's the key to who he is. Now, I've done other things. I gave a lecture a long time ago that was published eventually called Shakespeare and the Offstage Mob. That's, if you take a play like King John, which is not often performed and is an amazingly experimental play, the audience is constantly invited to identify with the unlettered, the people standing in the street, the artisan who drops his tools, the audience that doesn't applaud. And that happens again and again in Shakespeare, that he is a deeply subversive playwright. And the most subversive thing is that he convinces you that a king is less than a man, and a man is more than a king. That because of the king's role, he becomes a playing card. He becomes a front, he's called in King John. And he is really incapable of achieving his own salvation. In the case of Richard II, as a king, a disaster, a brat.
Yes.
And as somebody coming to terms with his mortality and his humanity, becomes towering, becomes luminous.
He sort of falls upwards at the end, doesn't
right.
he? Yeah.
But it happens again and again. And it must have been, and the Puritans knew this. They said, how can we have some periwig-pated fellow in you know, slippers trotting around the stage being a king in his nightshirt? This has got to be got to be wrong. And Shakespeare does it all the time. The king's moments of weakness, the king's loneliness, the king's threadbareness, the emptiness of the charade. Even in the case of Prince Hal, you know, Prince Hal goes from being a human being to being a king. And again, he has to betray.
He tells you that.
His old he says, this is it. This is what I am from now on, and this is what I have to do. And it's, in its way, tragic. Obviously, monarchy is madness. But it was a very tricky thing for anyone to say it in the 1590s and the 1600s.
Yeah, you had the great advantage. If this was a kind of a democratic aim, which is a large and modern and probably irrelevant word, but to give everyone a voice, you had this tremendous advantage. You could give everyone a great line. I mean, the man could be second watchman.
Gardener.
Yeah, a gardener or a gravedigger.
Caterpillars of the Commonwealth, all of that.
Or standing on the battlements in Elsinore with only one thing to say, and it turns out to be terrific. There's a generosity of language in it that is given to everybody, and especially the problem always with people who can make everyone sound poetic and witty is how do you make someone, the wit, sound witty? How do you give him something extra? And Shakespeare did that with, say, Beatrice and Benedict, and especially with Beatrice. I'm very fond of Beatrice.
But he also did it with the little boy in Love's Labour's Lost, with Moth, who is constantly rude to his master. And the master is rather like Shakespeare. You know, he's full of high-flown phrases.
Isn't the moth the one who brings down the pedants by saying they've been at a great feast of languages and have stolen the scraps? Moth's onto them, isn't he? Yeah.
Well, children often, and a dog in one case. In The Two Gentlemen, a dog steals the scene. You know, as Launce says, "Look at my hard-hearted dog," and the dog looks at the audience, and the audience thinks, "Oh, please, my dog, even my dog did not squeeze out a tear." Goes the dog.
Well, how can anyone be not thrilled by this? And your book brings that out.
You know who else understood this, and was slightly unnerved by it? Wittgenstein.
Yeah.
Who realised that this was something quite new. How can you do this? How can you hand the lunatic asylum over to the lunatics? But Shakespeare does it all the time.
Wittgenstein is a very, very interesting case to draw. First of all, you can't really imagine him responding to something like Shakespeare's language, which absolutely defies all of Wittgenstein's early principles about one thing meaning exactly one thing at a time. Shakespeare has so much ambiguity and implication. And then later on, Wittgenstein graduates to the position. We're probably going down a road here that will get us in the wrong direction. But he began to define language as how it was used. And Shakespeare, of course, is the very exemplar of that. Language is, in Shakespeare, is taken to its furthermost possible degree of implication. In the later plays, possibly it was hard to understand even for the people who were listening to it.
Except that, as I say to my students when I lecture to sixth formers, I point out to them that the language of every day is intensely ambiguous. So you meet somebody in the street and she says, "All right," and you say, "All right," which means, yes, nothing to report, don't want to stop, don't want to be rude, but basically, bugger off. And it's all done there, it's all in that one thing. And that when you actually talk to people, the way you say things is to do with how excited you are, how important it is, what the pressures are on you to say it, your heartbeat, your breath, your asthma, your whatever. And you actually speak something more like iambic pentameter than you do prose, because nobody except a university lecturer can actually speak prose. And Shakespeare understood that perfectly. What goes through everything is the breath length and the heartbeat. You don't need punctuation.